Hey, so I heard you support unions and workers' rights. Hey, it's Cecil, and it's Monday, and today is Labor Day, which here in the US means that a lot of people have the day off of work, and it's the day before the first day of school in a lot of places. And a lot of uninformed but well intentioned people are going to be posting on social media thanking our armed forces for a few years ago. It came to my attention that not a lot of people know what Labor Day is about. But I can't blame them because, to be honest, before I did my own research, neither did I. It's not really something that we hear about. Labor Day was mostly just like, oh, this is the last day of the social construct of summer. This is the last day before school starts. Tomorrow's the first day of school. Like, that's the meaning that Labor Day held. And it wasn't until maybe towards the end of high school that I had even learned at all that it had something to do with the labor unions. But as time went on, I would see posts thanking our military for their service. And I get it, most holidays in the US do actually celebrate the military and are very like, we're a pretty militarized nation. It's normal to expect something to be patriotic in that way, but that's not what this holiday's about. Usually when our schools talk about the workers' right movement, the labor movement, it's often tied in our lesson plans about the Industrial Revolution and talking about just the turn of the 20th century and all of that stuff. We don't usually get into the meat of why we have Labor Day as a holiday, of why we have workers' rights in the US, or about how far we still need to go in order to catch up with the rest of the world. But after a hot summer of strikes and going into a fall of strikes, it's clear that the US is in the middle of another pivotal moment for the labor movement. The middle class is dwindling, working conditions are worsening or just simply not improving. Wages are not keeping up with inflation, and executives are sitting on record profits. The working class is over it. Labor Day is a holiday to commemorate and to celebrate the achievements of the labor movement. It was first proposed in the early 1880s, and by 1894, Congress officially signed it into law as a federal, or passed a bill? I don't know. Congress acknowledged it as a federal holiday every first Monday of September. What was the labor movement here in the US, and why do we still need to know about it today? Let's talk about the history of workers' rights in the US. The concept of striking and the labor movement are both older than the US itself. Earliest records tell of a fisherman's strike in the 1630s off the coast of Maine. Before the turn of the 19th century, there were a lot of strikes, but they all existed as these very isolated, and they weren't one organized movement, right? It was temporary, it was isolated, and it was to solve an immediate problem. But as the Industrial Revolution came into full swing, working conditions were abysmal. Wages were low, hours were brutal, and workers obviously started to come together. They wanted to leverage their collective bargaining to improve their quality of life. America was still very new in the early 1800s, and so when we're like getting into this, there's not a lot of like pre-established rules as for whether or not workers have the right to organize and strike in the US, because before, obviously, they were going off of England's common law. And under the common law, things like this weren't necessarily allowed. Now, we're our own country, and they have to decide what is our law. The first half of the 19th century saw at least 23 cases of indictment for criminal conspiracy, and the legality of strikes and organized labor was consistently brought into question. Now, of those 23 cases, only two of them explicitly said that yeah, unionization was an illegal conspiracy to raise wages. Most others said that organized labor wasn't necessarily illegal, but their methods or their motives were. But in 1842, there was finally a verdict that was reached in favor of unions. They established in clear terms for the first time the legality of unions. This was Commonwealth v. Hunt. The judge ruled that workers were free to work for whom they please or not to work if they so prefer, and that organized labor movements could not be deemed illegal unless the thing they were doing was specifically laid out in the law as illegal. So, striking and bargaining, not necessarily illegal. Now, if their bargaining was literally robbing the store that they worked at, that would be illegal. So unless they're already breaking a law, the organization, not illegal. Does that make sense? Heading towards the 20th century, American industry had the highest rate of accidents in the world. And yet it was also one of the only industrial nations to not have any compensation programs for injured workers. By 1900, the wealthiest 2% owned over a third of the nation's wealth, and the wealthiest 1% owned over half of the nation's property. Economists began to fear that the US was becoming increasingly inegalitarian and too much like old Europe. In response, trade unions began to form, and favor grew with the populist, anarchist, and socialist movements. The coal strike of 1902 saw a fight for higher wages, shorter hours, and union recognition in Midwestern coal mines. With hard coal being a big fuel source in the winter, Teddy Roosevelt directly compromised and negotiated with the unions in order to get them better pay and hours so that they would return to work. However, he did not offer them official recognition of their union. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World were founded, leading strikes among textile workers, coal miners, and even farmers in their agricultural sector. They proved the power of organized, unskilled workers, spreading their goal of one big union, the working class all coming together under one union to leverage their power for better conditions. Of course, this idea of the entire working class working together was not very popular with the owning class or the government. So any unions that pushed for this idea were oftentimes suppressed and resisted. Between 1912 and 1918, 36 states adopted the principle of workers' compensation for accidents. Many prohibited the use of industrial poison, required at least one day off in a work week, limits on how long and how late working hours can go, and minimum wage laws were laid out for women. This last one was particularly important because by the start of World War I, women were joining a lot of the industrialized fields because all of the men were, at war. In 1919, there was another coal strike. They'd agreed to wages that would take them through the end of World War I, but the economy experienced a massive surge, and the owning class was experiencing some record profits. They were doing the work, and they were not getting to really share in these profits. So they struck. The Attorney General told them that it was illegal because it was interfering with the production and transportation of necessities during a war, but they walked out anyways. The coal operators decided to run a smear campaign against the unions, and this marked the start of the first Red Scare. They essentially said that Lenin and Trotsky had ordered and financed the strike, And they used that to leverage anti-union and anti-communist propaganda. Because of this, the union leader recalled his strike order, but many of the workers ignored this and continued their strike. After 5 weeks, the miners and the operators came to an agreement, and miners received a 14% raise. So during the 20s, there was a lot of post war affluence in the United States economy. As such, union memberships and action both saw a decline because, for the most part, everybody was starting to kind of benefit from this economic surge. And along with that, employers successfully were campaigning against the concept of unions. They were depicting organized labor as this alien concept to American culture, highlighting individualism. Individualism and the Red Scare both have their roots in anti union rhetoric. Color me unsurprised. There were still some strikes, of course, because as we all know, just because the economy is booming doesn't mean that everybody is benefiting. Textile and railroad workers both struck in 1922, fighting against proposed wage cuts. In a booming economy, cutting wages. But on September 1st, 1922, a federal judge issued a sweeping injunction against striking, assembling, and picketing in response to the rail workers. Sympathy strikes began popping up, resenting the ruling. Solutions were only found on the local level, but this sets the tone for the next century of how this country has been dealing with strikes and unions. When the Great Depression hit in October of 1929, union membership continued to drop as unemployment hit 25%. An economic crash, proving the inherent flaws of capitalism, seemed like a great time for something like organization, unionization, and the overthrowing of capitalism. But for the most part, everybody was kind of shell shocked. It went from being the roaring 20s to the Great Depression. And on top of that, union membership and the labor movement had already been in decline during the roaring 20s. So there wasn't organization that really existed to fall back on by the time they hit the Great Depression. Some workers turned to the Communist Party, recognizing that capitalism was falling apart. Even without union activity, there wasn't a complete lack of organization. Relief applicants held local, spontaneous marches and protests, and the Communist and Socialist parties were often behind a lot of the leading and the organizing. In 1931, coal workers in Harlan County, Kentucky, had their wages cut by 10% to maximize company profits. The United Mine Workers organized, but the employers evicted the mine workers from the coal town. So they relocated to the town of Everett, Kentucky, to plan union activity. So in response, the coal company goes and pays for the sheriff and 140 deputies to go against the miners, and as such, skirmishes developed and escalated between the strikers and the police. Gunfire was exchanged. Strike breakers were ambushed on their way to break the strike and beaten, and the Kentucky National Guard was called in. A Union rally was tear gassed on May 24th as the sheriff rescinded the county's right to assemble. No concessions were given to the workers' demands, and union membership plummeted. By June 17th, they returned to work. As you can imagine, this sort of event left them feeling burned out and disillusioned by organized labor. In 1932, President Hoover signed the Norris-LaGuardia Act, the first of many pro-union bills on the national scale. It offered protections against federal court injunctions during labor disputes, outlawed yellow dog contracts, which are contracts that employers would force employees to sign, stating they would not join a union or else they would be fired. As soon as FDR took office In 1933, he began implementing programs to alleviate the economic crisis, including the National Industrial Recovery Act, giving workers the explicit right to organize into unions, as well as establishing a minimum wage and maximum hours. It was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1935, but it fueled and strengthened unions, as well as the Wagner Act, which took its place. By 1941, union membership had almost quadrupled, going from 2.8 million to 8.4 million. That was 23% of the non agricultural workforce. It reached 14 million in 1945, 36% of the workforce. Unions were strong in the North, but they were weaker in the South, where mobilization attempts were often met with failure. The Conservative Coalition, an unofficial bipartisan anti-New Deal group in Congress, began to pass anti-union legislation. If you've researched union history before, you've probably heard of this one. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. You see, 1945 and 6 saw an unprecedented wave of strikes. There was another post-war economic surge, and yet again, the actual working class were not being allowed to truly benefit from the rewards. In response, the newly Republican-controlled Congress introduced this act to the House as H.R. 3020 in early 1947. President Truman vetoed this bill when it came to his desk, but Democrats and Republicans alike came together and overrode his veto, signing this act into law. The bill was promoted by big business lobbies such as the National Association of Manufacturers, which is really fucking funny. Because the bill stipulates that unions cannot make monetary donations to federal political campaigns. But business lobbies can. Other practices prohibited under the act include jurisdictional strikes, which are strikes organized and approved by union leadership. Wildcat strikes, which are strikes organized without the approval of union leadership. Solidarity and political strikes, which is strikes organized to support a separate but usually connected or related group or industry. Secondary boycotts, striking separate corporations in a similar industry or from the same company. Secondary mass picketing. Closed shops, which is when employers agree to only hire union members and employees will remain a union member the whole time they are employed. It also is the origin of right to work laws. Shout out to Michigan for no longer being a right to work state. Because this was enacted at the start of the Cold War and the labor movement has a long history with communism and socialism, the law also required union officials to sign non-communist oaths in order to be recognized. When Truman ran in 1948, he promised that he would repeal Taft-Hartley, but he never did. The act is still in effect today. The labor movement had been in steady decline ever since. Unions lost their influence with the Democrats, and pro-union Republicans became practically non-existent. Strikes became less and less effective by the 1970s and 80s as companies just threatened to move their factories to low-wage states or to foreign countries. And then, in 1981, Reagan, formerly the president of SAG-AFTRA, mind you, broke the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike, leading to its decertification. Numerous industries became deregulated in favor of free competition, despite objections of unions. Republicans began pushing legislation to curb the power of unions further and eliminate business regulations. But between 2016 and 2017, union memberships increased nationwide. Some states were seeing growth for the first time in several years, or even decades. In the first 3 quarters of 2022, union representation petitions filed with the National Labor Relations Board increased by 58%. There was a series of statewide teacher strikes and protests back in 2018, and there was a unionization within the high-tech sector. a walkout at Google in November of 2018, or Amazon workers in Staten Island becoming Amazon's first unionized workplace in 2022. Starbucks, Trader Joe's, and Chipotle have all began efforts for unionization for better working conditions. And this year has seen a summer of strikes. The WGA, SAG-AFTRA, flight attendants, and UPS almost striking, many more, all for the betterment of the working class. A 2023 study found that the US ranks among the worst, as in 32 out of a total of 38 countries for labor protections, including the right to organize. Labor historians say that we have the most violent labor history of any industrialized nation. The capitalist owning class are even less willing to compromise with the working class than in Europe, especially once neoliberal capitalism became the dominating global economic system. We are living in late-stage capitalism. Almost half of renter households in the US are rent-burdened. The top 10% own 69% of the nation's wealth. The top 1% holds over a quarter of the nation's wealth. The bottom 50% owns less than 3% of the nation's wealth. Think about that. The labor movement is coming back to life slowly but surely, and it is so important to find ways to get involved, to show support. We deserve better than this. It's not going to be some one day impromptu general strike that runs on social media every few months. It is going to start with meeting your neighbors, with mutual aid. It's going to start with masking in public so that disabled people can take part in the community as much as everybody else. It's dismantling our internal biases. We need to connect with our community, support each other. Living this every man for himself isn't working when the everyman is drowning. Happy Labor Day. And for everyone desperate to start the revolution, I get it. I do, because this is not sustainable, but I hope it brings you some comfort to know that you don't need to start the revolution. You're already in one. Oh boy. That was a lot to research, and quite a bit of it made me feel very righteously angry. The working class in this country deserves so much more than what we've got, and I am going to leave some links in the description box that will talk about ways to find unions and strikes going on in your area, as well as some of the links that I used for the research for this video, if there is anyone who wants to do some extra reading. Thank you so much for watching. This is something that's very important to me, and I hope that you learned something, or if you already knew all of this, thanks for sticking around to this point. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and you can follow me in the links in the description box below. Be a bro, share this video with another union-loving bro, and if you have not done so yet, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.